Thank you for the good introduction, Frédéric, and thank you also for inviting me here to the MSH, the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. I'm very pleased to be here in this context, which is very creative, to talk about a creative sector, which is photography, and a creative instrument, which is the camera and the origins of the camera. And much of the writing about cameras and photography has been about how photographs represent things, or how photographs create a kind of instantaneity, the punctum we've heard about with photography. I'm taking a very different approach. I'm going to look at it as an historical artifact, and I'm also going to look at it as a way of promoting a certain kind of ideology which is almost deterministic. In other words, instead of looking at photography as the product of a particular episteme or episteme, I'm going to look at it as the product of a 6,000-year-old engineering project, which, for better or for worse, has resulted in the society we're in. So the other part I'm going to take that's rather unusual is I'll use visual argument to make my case. I'm not going to talk too much about theory. The theory, in other words, will emerge from practice, and I think rather than explain the reasons for doing this, I'm going to jump right into it. So I started with the question, what is photography? And at first I thought this would be a pretty easy question to answer, because photography was arguably invented just in the 1820s, not 200 years ago, although it's based on some technologies which come earlier, and we're going to get into that. But I found, as I investigated the origins of this medium, that they go much, much earlier. Therefore, I'm going to go in reverse chronological terms, and I'll let my argument emerge from this. So the first part I'd like to confront you with is this matter of convergent evolution. Now, what do I mean by this? On the one hand, we have a biological apparatus, which we're familiar with, which are eyes. Eyes operate according to optical principles, and these optical principles are physically described. They're part of our innate physiology, not just human physiology, but all animals, and they are essential to life and to navigating the world. But as it turns out, there's also a technical apparatus, the camera, which operates on pretty much exactly the same principles of the eye, which is the focusing of light rays onto a medium of communication. With the camera, that communication medium, well, originally was simply a wall, as we'll see. Then it became film. Now it is charged diodes. It's these CCDs and various kinds of silicon couplings, which take electronic measurements and digitize images. In terms of our own bodies, nothing has much changed for hundreds of millions of years. We have a retina. That retina has nerve endings. Those nerve endings contain rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is a light-sensitive substance which creates ionic gradients or electrical charges that are then communicated to the brain. And that's what forms images. Images are actually formed in our mind, although there is an image on the back of our eye and also within the camera. And if you notice here, actually the image is inverted. So there's some processing going on at a very fundamental level in the brain. So what we have here are two forms of representation. One is technical representation. This is something that we do with a camera. The other is manual representation. In other words, what we do with the camera, and I chose these two images because they are very similar to each other, is very similar to perspectival painting. So the thing that triggered my foray into an history of engineering actually was the fact that I started to think, well, maybe photography automates something that happens much earlier. This is the first photograph. It's the University of Texas at Austin, where I did my doctorate. It's by Joseph Nicephore-Niepce, and it's the view of Le Gras just out his window. And you see actually that there are some similarities in these. We'll see why these images all appear similar, but the question that became the key to answering what is photography is does photography automate the manual perspective of perspectival representation? And if automation is the essence of photography, in other words, photography does not necessarily represent a critical epistemic juncture in history. Now, recall a lot of the writing that you may have read about photography says that there's this absolute break between the pre-photographic era and the photographic era. And certainly there have been a lot of social effects that have happened because of the industrialization of photography. But let's not forget that in the 19th century, a lot of things were industrialized, such as sewing, mining, transportation. So let's start with the technological history. This will be the first part of my talk today. We want to look at the history of the camera technology in the context of cameras being just another form of automation, of something that was practiced quite extensively through history. And just to jump back to these paintings, there was a lot of demand for perspectival paintings for hundreds of years. And that was the disruptive part of photography, not necessarily the kind of knowledge effects that photography creates. And these knowledge effects are actually going to become more important the deeper we go into history. So the camera, of course, there's a camera recording this presentation today, is based on a much older technology called the camera obscura. That's at least 500 years old. It goes back to the Renaissance, actually, but the principles of it are older. We'll see that in a moment. We can see how the camera obscura is operated, and that is the way that the lens or even a pinhole can take an image and focus it on a plane of representation, on a medium of representation, and that can then be copied. So here's a couple of examples of how people can create optically accurate drawings. In other words, perspectival representations based with the camera obscura. So there's already a step towards automation here. This painting here that was done by Willem Koekkoek was probably not done with the camera obscura. He used other techniques, much more difficult ones. He had to know a fair amount of geometry and optics and be a good draftsperson in order to create this. The people in these images are able to just trace pretty good paintings on their own. So here's the first step of automation, the camera obscura. So here's Niepce, just to recap, automating photography. This photograph was probably made in 1826 or so. There's a museum in his old house where you can actually see a representation of the view here. That'll be on the left, and the camera itself that he used is sitting in the museum nearby. And now, this effect that works in the camera obscura is the pinhole effect, and this was quite well known since the Renaissance. There's a drawing of it, but there were other attempts than cameras to make perspectival drawings. Here's a very famous engraving by Dürer, where he uses this grid. And notice how he's looking at the subject through this grid. The grid will become very, very important as this presentation goes on. So here's the first hint of it. You can also look at this treatise from Vauxlezard, which is dedicated to the construction of perspectival scales. We're now looking at about the 17th century here. This uses a procedure that's employed for scanning of the optical line, and this figure of scanning is actually used quite widely even now in television and in computers. In other words, you're scanning through a grid and creating either a geometric or optical presentation. Here are a few more examples of the grid being used to get optical accuracy. On the left is Robert Flood's sighting grid from 1617. On the right is John Bates's sighting grid, and both use eyepieces. In other words, this point of perspective, which is the human eye, to recreate and project what the eye sees backwards into the eye and onto a medium of representation. There were other attempts to automate, such as the perspectograph. This is Jean-François Nisserand in 1652, created ways of sighting optically accurate sight lines, and you'll see the line here is important, and the light travels in rays. So what we could do is use the physical instantiation of the ray, either by having a guided line of sight or an actual string. And some perspectographs use strings. Just a few more images to show how widespread this practice was in the 16th century. This is a famous one by Leonardo da Vinci. He is working on getting an accurate drawing of an armillary sphere, which is a globe that represents the cosmos. We'll see later on that mapping the cosmos and mapping the Earth was quite important, and the issue of representing a sphere in two-dimensional space becomes very, very important in the early history of this medium. Here's a perspectival analysis of Da Vinci's Last Supper, and you see that it's quite accurate in terms of the grid of perspective that is not superimposed, well, it's superimposed here by the scholar, but actually it also is a foundation or underlies the drawing of the Last Supper, and you saw that in de Koekkoek's painting earlier. Here you have a cello's Miracle of the Desecrated Host. Again, there are no lines drawn on this, but if you let your eye follow the lines in the ceiling and especially the floor, you'll see that they converge on a single point, and that is the point of vanishing point perspective, which is the point where the eye sees, and that's the point of subjectivity. And it's interesting here because we actually represent subjectivity not in philosophic terms, but in engineering terms. And those engineering terms have become the basis of major industries and also ideological movements based on those industries, including governments and surveillance. And this will become important as we see and move into the earlier history. So actually, I'll give you a hint about what's to come. The ideological and technological effects of photography become, or its history becomes stronger the further back we look. Now notice, this painting is from 1465. There's going to be a phase shift in the methods of representation. Here's a painting from 1425 by Masaccio, and it has some perspectival effects. You can look at the coffered ceiling, you can look at the walls there. There are many, many more examples of this, similar to this, where you have something that is groping towards perspective, but it's not accurate. So what happened between 1425 and 1465? We're going to get into that in a moment. Here's another painting by Giotto from the 14th century. Again, there's a kind of perspective here, but it's not accurate from a mathematical point of view, and because it's not mathematically or optically, scientifically accurate, it doesn't appear realistic because it doesn't function according to that convergent technology or convergent structure of the eye and the camera. So Giotto and Masaccio were practicing what we call empirical perspective. They could see that lines converge, in other words, parallel lines converge. That's something that's going to come up again, but they couldn't formalize it. Now, how did somebody learn to formalize it between 1465 and, say, 1425? I'm going to give you that answer. One more example, Cimabue, even cruder form of empirical perspective. So let's look at the origin of optical representation. Actually, this is quite clearly defined. We have it in Leon Battista Alberti's publication, De la Peinture, on the picture. And it's a treatise on drawing. It's an actual guidebook, published 1435, 1436, maybe developed a little bit earlier. And he actually outlines how to do perspective and how to draw that grid in a way that takes the objective geometric grid that we're familiar with, the Cartesian grid, and turns it into an optical grid where you have parallel lines converge. In a Cartesian grid, in the grid of geometric space, which we all know intuitively because we move in geometric space, we know that if you see a person next to you and a tiny house in the distance, that person is not bigger than the house. We have an innate geometric sense, but we also conveniently use optics to understand that person is closer to us, even though they appear larger. Here's an example of Alberti's visual pyramid. That's how he defines this. He says that there's actually a pyramid between the eye and the object, and that pyramid can be projected onto a planar space. So the elements that are really important to look at in this picture are the eye, which is the point of perception, the point of subjectivity, the object, here portrayed with optical accuracy, but we know that's a cube. We know it's not a rhomboid. It's actually cubical. And then that plane of projection, which is pictorial space, the space of representation. And we can see the distortion caused by looking at a geometric object from a single point in space through a series of lines that are convergent from that object to that single point of space. And those lines could be lines of light, which are the rays that animate cameras and physical eyes, or they could be drawn with strings. You'll see in other representations of draftspeople trying to draw perspectively that they actually pull strings between the corners of an object and the point in space that they're trying to represent. So here's a drawing of what's happening, actually. You can see there's the distance from the eye to the picture, and that distance is represented in a vanishing point. And these lines that are called orthogonals actually take straight lines and they converge. And this convergence goes all the way back to Euclid's optics. And Euclid famously stated in his Optics, which is a counterpart to his masterwork on geometry, that in optics, parallel lines converge. And that's the major difference between optics and geometry. In geometry, if a line is parallel, by definition, it doesn't converge. Geometry is objective reality. Optics is subjective appearances. In other words, there's something about the eye that creates this illusion of parallel lines converging. And as early as Plato, we have people, Platon, we have people saying that there's something wrong with subjectivity because of this. It distorts the nature of reality. What we have with optics is a translational science that gives us an objective view of the subjective world. And that is critical in both the success of the technology, in other words, things like television and film, which we find entertaining because they're realistic. Now we're finding that things that appear realistic can be deep fakes and form propaganda. Those same representations also become evidence in the laws of court or public opinion. So this translation point right there, that vanishing point, the lines representing the visual rays are a pivot upon much of history turns, from the earliest forms of surveillance to contemporary surveillance to political opinion, which is formed by our increasing ability to create fake subjectivity and by corollary fake objectivity. In other words, the deep fake. And all of that goes back to the visual pyramid. This is the page from one of the publications of Alberti's texts. So you can see this is just a redrawing of this page in Alberti. So here we are looking at a city. We know all these buildings are rectilinear, but everything appears angular and the lines are converging on a vanishing point. Where did all this start, and where did Alberti learn this? So what triggered this publication in 1435 that, as I've already shown, and it's well established that prior to Alberti you have these groping attempts to form a real subjective illusion, Giotto, Cimabue, others, Masaccio, and after this publication, people could create quite good illusions of reality. Well, let's look at the baptistry of Florence. The baptistry itself was not a factor in the development of perspective, except insofar as Bruno Brunelleschi used it to demonstrate the possibility of a formalized optical perspective. So this is a drawing of Brunelleschi's from 1428, and you see that this is optically accurate. So it's rather precocious. It's a precocious and early example of formal perspective. It came out before Della Pittura. Well, one thing to know is that Brunelleschi and Alberti were quite close. They're part of the same circle. Brunelleschi was a little bit older, a mentor to Alberti, but they studied together. And sometime in the early 15th century, at the beginning of the Quattrocento, Brunelleschi did a demonstration of perspective. And he was standing very excitedly out in front of the baptistry, and he had a painting of the baptistry, a mirror, and then a sighting hole. And in that painting, there was a little hole there that he could view the baptistry itself. And so actually what he did is he had this demonstration. It's a little hard to understand, but he had this illusion, this screen, as it were, and in fact the ancestor of every screen in existence, the one in your pockets, the one on the walls at your home, the one that adorn the interiors of public buildings, and increasingly the exteriors. And he was showing how he could create an image of the baptistry, hold it in front of the baptistry, and through this funny apparatus with a hole in it, see that the image of the baptistry completely lines up with the actual view of the baptistry. So this person standing there with this mirror facing the painting, but with a hole in the mirror so you can view through it, could look at the painting and then look at the baptistry itself, and well, they appeared similar. So these are all drawings that were made after the fact. Now, how did Brunelleschi come up with this? Brunelleschi didn't actually attribute it to himself. What it was attributed to, and there's a good book by a scholar named Samuel Edgerton called The Renaissance Rediscovery of Linear Perspective. In this book, Edgerton describes how there was a reading group in Florence, and they met, say, the end of the 1300s, early 1400s, and they were working to revive classical texts. At the time, Claudius Ptolemy was well known, mainly through his Almagest, through his work on the heavens, but at the end of the 14th century, a Byzantine copy in Greek of his geography was imported into Florence and studied by this reading group, which included Brunelleschi and probably Alberti. And the geography, as I'll get into more deeply later, contains methods of perspectival representation. So although the documentation is not firm, in other words, no one documented or wrote down, well, we studied these methods of perspective in the geography, and then we developed and extrapolated this method, and I wrote Della Pittura, say, from Alberti. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. In other words, this circle of people read the geography, studied it intently, and then they were able to constitute or reconstitute an earlier form of perspective as part of the general revival of classical culture that we call the Renaissance, the rebirth. So there actually was a rebirth going on here, the rebirth of cartographic projection, or what we would now call projective geometry. projective geometry being the underlying framework in which optics happens. I will get into the into Ptolemaic theory and his methods in a moment, but first I just want to keep working chronologically through history. You'll see Ptolemy wrote in the 1st century AD. This was, let's say, 150. He might have been writing the geography in 130, but it was revived in the 15th century, and it was pretty much unknown after its initial publication, despite his fame in astronomy. And let's look at what people did know in Europe, Europe being where photography was invented, about, say, the pinhole effect. Well, in the 13th century, the English philosopher Roger Bacon had a drawing where he showed that images were projected through square apertures, could then be projected on walls. There's some problems with this manuscript, but he's saying that it's a great way to study solar eclipses, and in fact, studying solar eclipses seems to be one of the main uses of the pinhole effect. So there was something about the Renaissance where this became a method of representation and representation of general physical space. It was never used that way before. That's the historical, unprecedented part of history that started with, say, Alberti and Brunelleschi. Before that, the pinhole effect, or the camera obscura, which could use a lens but also uses a pinhole, was not really used for anything but scientific study. And actually, I should clarify now that cameras use lenses, but they could also be done with the pinhole. You may have heard of a pinhole camera. This is because a pinhole functions as a lens. What a pinhole does is it parses the light. So essentially only one light ray from each point on that object. I should probably go back here to illustrate this. Right here you can see each point only creates one impression on the plane of representation. You can see that, point A is becoming point large a is becoming point small a on the plane of representation. The same goes with B, K, etc. So that's quite important in the pinhole effect. All a lens does is make the pinhole effect more efficient so that you can gather more light, so you get a brighter image. If you work with a pinhole camera, you have quite long exposures. If you work with a lens, which concentrates light, and the lenses, I can't get into it right now, but they refract light in a way that make it function, make a much larger aperture function like a pinhole. Ibn al-Haytham in the 10th century, the 900s, also studied the pinhole effect and worked on trying to explain how it functions. He was using candles and saying, well, why is it that a candle is projected in a box? You can see both his diagram and up there this example of the candle, which is also widely used other than eclipses. Even earlier, Al-Kindi writes about the same thing in the 9th century. So we see actually quite a tradition of pinhole, at least in the most esoteric scientific circles, studying of the pinhole. Anthemius of Tralles actually, in the 6th century, writes about it. And he also was one of the architects of the Hagia Sophia, just as an anecdote. So he worked on light ray diagrams. And then finally, in the 5th century, there's a treatise called the Problemata by Pseudo-Aristotle. They said it was Aristotelian. Later they found out it wasn't written by Aristotle. It was written 500 years later, but they said it was Aristotle for prestige. And he says, well, why is it that the eclipse of the sun, if looked at through a sieve or through leaves, such as a tree, or even joining your fingers together, form crescent-shaped rays when they reach the earth? So actually, I did this drawing here to illustrate that, but this shows a much cruder understanding of the pinhole than the later versions. In other words, he never mentions using a box or creating a pinhole camera. The earliest we see that is Al-Kindi, actually. So the question is, was there a classical perspective some people, other than Edgerton, have questioned whether anything like an understanding of perspective, practical perspective or perspectival optics, which is actually a redundant term, existed before the Renaissance. One thing to keep in mind is that optics is a Greek term, perspectiva is a Latin term. Both have come into English and French, but actually they mean the same thing foundationally. Perspective and optics are just different terms for the same thing, but we have given them a different weight now in contemporary culture, but that different weight prejudices our understanding of these histories. We're saying, oh, well, perspective is just something to do with paintings and representations, and optics is a science or a technology. They really don't meet, and you have treatises some of you may be familiar with about how perspective is this movement in art, and they don't get into the science or engineering of it. I think that's wrong-minded and misleading, actually. I respect those for the scholarly work that's done, but it's misleading in terms of history and what the medium actually is, because they both mean the same thing. The question is, when does this arise? Here's a painting from Pompeii, and there is some painting evidence. So now we'll look at this evidence space, and I'm going to run through different kinds of evidence for classical perspective, starting with some of the few remaining paintings. You have a landscape with a villa from about 35-45 AD, the 1st century in Pompeii, in the house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto. And this looks a lot like what you might have seen in Uccello. There's an understanding that parallel lines may converge, but no formal underlying structure. In other words, it's not optically accurate. Here's another example where there's an attempt at perspective. You have a kind of empirical perspective. This is from the villa of Fannius Sinister. But again, this early Roman painting, presumably based on Greek antecedents, doesn't really show what we need. Unfortunately, most of the painting from Rome, and particularly Greece, where we would have expected the most sophisticated examples to exist, just have been lost. So, but this evidence shows that they were at least aware of these optical effects. Things aren't just a flat pictorial space. There's an attempt to introduce depth, i.e. the third dimension, into pictorial space. Now, I'd like to look at Vitruvius. Here you see the grid. This is from Vitruvius's De Architectura, which was written in the 1st century BC. Vitruvius was an architect, and he describes scenography in his treatises on architecture, and I'm going to read that because it's telling, and it can be interpreted in different ways. The Latin is a bit ambiguous, but this is part of I guess this body of evidence that we're trying to build. And Vitruvius describes a method of sketching a building's front with the sides receding into the background, the lines all meeting in the center of a circle. Some people have said this is not, there's ambiguities here in what he means by the circle and whether the lines really meet. But then he talks about Agatharchos, when Aeschylus was presenting a tragedy, made the setting, the skena for it, and left behind a commentary. And instructed by him, Democritus and Anaxagoras wrote on the same subject, and they were demonstrating how it followed that if a definite center is constituted for the line of vision and also the extension of the radii therefrom, one follows these lines in accordance with natural law, so that ill-defined images from a thing which are not so clearly defined may produce the appearance of the buildings in the pictures of the stage setting. And although all things on the figures are flat, vertical planes, some appear to be in the background and some in the foreground. So this is scenography. And actually, Plato has a long screed about scenography and says this is just the creation of illusion. Plato, as we know, derided illusion. He didn't like illusion. In fact, he goes off on a lot of Greek art and says Egyptian art is superior because it shows reality. It's objective. These things which create the effects of the eye, which are subjective, they just play to our desires and they trick our minds. That's an important philosophic pivot around subjectivity and objectivity. But then let's actually go back up here and look at Proclus's, or listen to Proclus's description of optics. He's writing about dioptrics. He says, again, optics and catoptrics, in other words, the study of reflections or offshoots of arithmetic and geometry. The former uses visual lines and the angles made by them. It is divided into a part specifically called optics, which explains the illusory appearances presented by objects seen at a distance, such as the convergence of parallel lines, and general catoptrics, which is concerned with the ways in which light is reflected. The latter is closely bound up with the art of representation and studies what is called scene painting, scenography, showing how objects can be represented by images that will not seem disproportionate when seen at a distance or on an elevation. What we have here is a resonance between classical, at least ancient Greek and probably Roman entertainment, where you had a play and they wanted to have the illusion of distance, and modern theater, where you have a theatrical stage which wants to create the illusion of a three-dimensional environment, or for that matter, film, television, or virtual reality, all of which work to create an optical illusion. In other words, take an eye and trick it when it's looking at a 2D object into thinking that it's looking at a three-dimensional environment. So we have a lot of circumstantial evidence about classical perspective and the ability to create this subjective, illusory space that has a kind of scientific rigor here. So, even though Plato says, well, they're just creating illusions, they're tricking people, they're playing to their desires, and actually that resonates strongly now with fake news and deep fakes, where literally you do have political effects, but Plato anticipated these political effects. He said, look, you expose people to falsehoods, in other words, the false appearance of reality, a deep fake, whether it's done in a classical Greek theater or your mobile phone, and they're going to have misconceptions about reality. Let's go back to the evidence now and the science behind this. There was Euclid, who wrote the great book on geometry, still valid today, studied intensively up through the 19th century. People still read a lot of it, actually, for basic training in geometry. But he also wrote a companion book to the geometry, much shorter, called The Optics, in which he changes some of those propositions. And the one that I'll just go over quickly some of his work on some of his theorems, but the one that we really wanted to look at is that parallel lines converge, and why do objects in the distance appear smaller. And the proposition where he talks about parallel lines converging is a bit complex, and I won't present that here, but you can see here that in the drawings used for different theorems about the shift from geometric space to optical space, you can see that why perspective could emerge from optical science, or did optical science emerge from perspective? And I'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, the angle of appearance of two things that are a different size changes to the eye when those objects are farther apart. So let's say that GD is a house and AB is a person, and AB is a meter away and GD is 30 meters away. Well, the person might appear the similar size as the house or the building if they're at these different distances, and this is why different objects appear smaller. Now, we could end the story right here and say, well, here we have Euclid's optics, and optics generated perspective, the techniques of perspective, and Euclid was later than Plato, but maybe the things that Plato are describing and some of these earlier writers are describing are empirical perspective. In other words, they're quasi-illusionary, they're not scientifically rigorous. But I need to put a proposition forward to you. I mean, has science ever come out full sprung from the exploration of propositions or the exploration of physical reality? That's a dubious statement. Usually science comes from a long series of developments. And those developments start with practical techniques and practical methods. And optics and geometry of Euclid, the optics and geometry of Euclid are so developed that they must represent centuries of development. And we see in earlier philosophers talk about theorems, particularly in the Pythagoreans, there's talk about theorems. So these theorems were finally consolidated by Euclid, and then Euclid was so canonical that it wiped out a lot of the earlier history. And of course, these texts were generated thousands of years ago. So they've probably just disappeared into the sands of history. But I was determined to find out why Euclid wrote the geometry and actually wrote the optics too, and what kind of techniques might have emerged. So let's continue to look at the evidence before Euclid. But first we'll go into Claudius Ptolemy's, who came out after Euclid, and his geography. So in the geography, there was this desire to map the world, and that gets back into that painting that we looked at, or the lithograph of Leonardo da Vinci taking the sphere and trying to project it onto the planet. So, okay, in Euclid we have a developed science. So I went back to the really first, earliest, and only known exposition of the science of optics in the classical era. Now I'm going to jump forward to Hellenistic era, 350 years after Euclid, and look at this issue that we're dealing with, which is the practical issue of representation. And we've also looked at roughly contemporaneous paintings, which may result, in Pompeii, you may not have had the best artists, actually. I mean, it was sort of an important city, but it was also provincial. So the paintings may not represent the height of classical art. Here in Ptolemy, you have the height of classical representation, and this is a world map that was done in the 15th century, but based on Ptolemy's 2nd century map of the world. It took over 1,000 years for anyone to supersede Ptolemy. And let me show you the problem that he was confronting and why the sphere and the representation of the spherical space onto a flat surface is such an issue. If you actually want to have a geographically or accurate map of the world, you have to use what's called a sinusoidal projection. In other words, a sphere does not develop on a plane accurately. You have to chop it up and then spread it out. This is what a sphere looks like on a flat surface. Otherwise, you have a projection, and you have quite complex mathematics involved in doing something like a sinusoidal projection, which just isn't very useful for our purposes. And the three methods, which still stand today, that are done by, also demonstrated in Ptolemy, are the cylindrical, in other words, the projection of the sphere onto the cylinder, which is then unraveled onto a flat surface, a conical projection, and azimuthal projection. Here's a conical projection. Your map looks like this. And just imagine all the continents within the borders that are defined by those lines, those projection lines. I won't show an example. Here's azimuthal projection. That is the one that Ptolemy prefers. That's this one, which, well, it looks sort of spherical and cylindrical and is sort of accurate. And then finally, there's the third projection, which is spherical projection. And actually, that uses a vanishing point. And that is the smoking gun, as it were. in the classical era. We have these paintings which grope towards vanishing point perspective. I've shown you those. We have Vitruvius's and Proclus's description, which arguably describe a vanishing point, but because of ambiguities in the Latin and the translation and no visual examples of the technique in the text, can be argued are not vanishing point perspective. But Ptolemy's third method, which is extant in the text, exists. It dates to the 1st century Hellenistic era, and that was studied by Brunelleschi and Alberti. That is the moment when you have a transition from this empirical perspective, the perspective of the unknown paintings of the villas in Pompeii, and also the still existing paintings from pre-Renaissance or early Renaissance Italy, say the Cimabue, the Giotto, and then all of a sudden you have Brunelleschi drawing with perspectival accuracy. You have a handbook of perspective, Della Pittura, which was rapidly translated and traveled all through Europe, and you have Da Vinci and many, many other painters doing optically accurate representations of reality. Now, some of them took liberties with it, but they did it for artistic license. They understood when they were distorting the perspectival reality because they wanted to tell good stories, but there are paintings which are essentially photographs. So here's the beginning of the method which became photography. In other words, the optically accurate and scientifically rigorous translation of three-dimensional space projected onto a two-dimensional plane. And it's actually a fulcrum between subjectivity and objectivity, between, say, truth and illusion, if you want to put it that way. And it has many, many ideological effects, which I've touched upon, such as the fact that an optically accurate representation of a situation can be evidence in the court of law. It also is a great stimulus to scientific observation, whether it's astronomy, cartography, environmental tracking, or microscopy. So right here you have the beginning of a very, very powerful technology which continues to influence us today, even though classical optics has been joined by physiological optics and other forms of optics, which quantum optics, which don't just rely on the straight line and the Euclidean propositions. Just to show some of the background for Euclid, because I'm going to go, we will be leaving Greece pretty soon, and I'm going to give a few hints of where we're going. Many centuries before Euclid, you had, say, the Rind mathematical papyrus. The Egyptians were conversant with geometry, whether they had what we call geometric science, in other words, a formalized geometry is up to question, probably not true. Science seemed to be systematized in 6th century Miletus and 6th century Greek culture, in other words, put into formal axioms and propositions. But the practical application, bordering on a theoretical understanding, appeared much earlier in Egypt, and in fact, the Greeks themselves attributed their mathematical knowledge to the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. And there's a lot of evidence from Mesopotamia and a lot of sophistication in the mathematical texts. This is a text which shows how it's from the old Babylonian kingdom of Eshuna, which shows how you can calculate the size of triangles and calculate the size of fields. Now, I'm not going to get into the mathematical text too deeply because what I'm really concerned with here is representation and the representation of physical reality. Now, there's no evidence for optical representation before Greece, but there's a great deal of evidence for geometric representation in the earlier, more ancient cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And there's also a transition between optical representation or geometric representation, in other words, something that's pictorial, and what we would now call data. So let's dive into that evidence a little bit more deeply. This is a land surveying document. It's from the Old Babylonian period, and it displays the approximation of the square root of 2. And you can see that this, although it's just taken as a mathematical text, is used for calculating surface area. And surface area is actually essential to pictorial representation. What you have in that difference between a geometric representation and optical representation is a shift in the visible surface area of an object. Things farther away have apparently less surface area than things that are closer. And people were exploring this now 3,000 years ago, at least. I'm going to now dive into this topic from a few different evidence bases. We've looked at the evidence from science. Science, I won't get into debates about whether there was actually a science before it was constituted formally in Greek philosophy. The Mesopotamians were very, very sophisticated mathematicians, but that debate and that discussion, interesting as it is, we'll leave aside for right here. Let's start with sculpture, though. Because this shows the difference between subjectivity and objectivity. This is a sculpture called the Doryphus. It's actually found in Pompeii, but it was copied from 5th century Greece, and it's a copy of a painting by of a sculpture by Polykleitos. Polykleitos being one of the most famous and well-known sculptors, and he was well known for his realism. And it's called the Canon because it demonstrates the perfect proportions of the body. In other words, the ratios of the size of the hands to the head, and the size of the feet to the legs, and the legs to the arms. And this was all expressed as a series of ratios called the Canon of Polykleitos. And actually, it was called the Canon because that canon expressed as numbers, as a set of figures, was used extensively in sculptures so that people could get the kind of accuracy you get in drawing. If you've ever taken a drawing class, you always know that, the nose is halfway down from the head, although intuitively it doesn't seem like that, and that there's so many fists in terms of the size of your body and the length of the arms all have a kind of classical proportion, and that is a kind of canon. Let's look at this earlier form of art, the Greek kouros. Now the Greek kouros doesn't seem as realistic as the Doryphus. This has this kind of lifelike quality to it. And let's just remember Plato's words and how this lifelike quality echoes Plato's criticism of subjectivity. And also think about, in a way of foreshadowing, Plato's claim that Egyptian culture was superior to Greek culture. Now we all look at, say, Greek statuary and Egyptian statuary and say, well, clearly Greek statuary is kind of superior because it's so much more realistic. Why would Plato make this claim? Now, here's a transitional phase between Greek sculpture and Egyptian culture, the kouros. There was a lot of trade between Greek and Egypt, always, and there was also a lot of influence. But the Greeks got from this to this. And what we can see in that transition from the kouros to the canon, the Greek canon, is a move towards subjectivity, the subjective representation of reality. What we might call illusion, but is it really illusion if it's done with scientific accuracy, optical accuracy? Optics gives a translation between the capacity to create illusion and scientific and mathematical rigor. And that's actually why we can build cameras and perspectographs and, in fact, these huge media networks, because we can engineer illusion. It's illusory, but it's engineered because it has scientific and formal accuracy. And now we're starting to get into the deep history of how those sciences and technologies arose, how they were engineered, and what the primordial ideological basis of these technologies are. So let's go from this transitional phase, 6th century BCE, to a more originary phase, which is 25 centuries, about 19 centuries before that, and Egyptian portraiture. Now these clearly look like the Kurus, and they seem sort of not realistic. I mean, we always look at Egyptian sculpture and think, well, it's not very realistic, it's very stylized. This is an old kingdom, 4th dynasty portrait of Menkora, and this shows a kind of stylization, but actually the Egyptians had a canon too, and we'll see that this canon uses the grid, and please bear the grid in mind. This is a drawing that was found, a very rare drawing on papyrus, dated somewhere between 2600 BC and 2100 BC. But the Egyptian canon of art underwent several changes, but it was actually quite rigorous and quite naturalistic. These squares are called fists. Each one is a measurement. And in fact, the Egyptian style is not naturalistic in the way that it's illusionistic, but it's naturalistic in the way that it is quite accurate in its presentation of the proportions of the subject of the matter of art, whether they're human or animals, but particularly with the humans, they're accurate. And they seem twisted in space because actually they wanted to show as much of the surface area of the human as possible, whether in sculpture or in the paintings that we find in the walls of Egyptian tombs. So we could see why Plato said this is a superior form of art, because it doesn't strive for illusion, it strives for objectivity. It has the proper proportions of the subject, but it also presents the maximum information about that subject without trying to create an illusion that the subject is there. So there's the Egyptian canon, and there's a lot of documentation about how the Egyptian canon influenced the Greek canon, and the Greeks adapted it along with Egyptian and, as we'll see, Mesopotamian science to form the formalization of the practical application of geometry and geometric representation into the practical application of optics and optical representation, and ultimately the science of optics, which then, for all intensive purposes, jumped from the Hellenistic era to the Renaissance, and then from the Renaissance, the path to our contemporary culture of representation is clear. Here's another body of evidence about the grid. This has to do with urban design. The rigor of Roman civil planning is quite clear. We have Roman street plan here. They used the grid. There's centuriated fields that still exist much later. They always had a Cardo Maximus and a Decumanus Maximus, and they imposed that grid quite rigorously. In classical Greece, we also have grids. This is the plan of Miletus, a very old city, but was replanned by Hippodamus in the 4th century BCE, and was actually applied by a lot of the Seleucid kings who were mass-producing cities across Asia Minor. You see grids in Alexandria, Apamea, Aleppo, and Damascus. Amarna in Egypt is a much earlier example of the grid. You see this was built by Akhenaten as his capital city when he abandoned the worship of Ammon. And you see this is laid out on a very orthogonal, grid-like structure, very geometric. The Egyptian hieroglyph for the city actually embeds the grid in it. And then the earliest example we see of a grid anywhere in practical application is Kahun in Egypt, which was the workers' village for building the Al-Lahun pyramid, and that was built probably under the reign of King Senusret II during the Middle Kingdom period. And just for contrast, you can see the layout of an autochthonic city. For a good example of that, just walk around central Nantes or Paris, and you can see how that differs from the grid that started in Kahun and is exemplified in Manhattan. They're very easy to find their way around. Now here's some evidence from surveying. How were grids made? Well, you had the groma. You can see this rectilinear form in a groma. There's a mechette, which was used to draw straight lines. And then finally, these tools of surveying, sighting rods, gromas, and this rope of land, pulling lines straight. So to create a rope of land that gave you a measure, you pull the lines straight, and that creates the equivalent of that ray of light. So we start to find this equivalence between building things and rays of light. Just to give you an example of what happens in perspective, you have this straight cylinder, and when you twist it, it's foreshortened, and that's perspective, and that's not what happens here. Here's some representations of Egyptian surveyors. It was called pulling the rope. This was a sacred act, the laying out of an architectural structure, or the laying out of the field. They were called the harpedonoptene, and they were actually around since time immemorial in Egypt, so quite important in Egypt. And what was the parallel development? Well, you had town planning in Mesopotamia. So here's a surveying map of Nippur. Obviously not an orthogonal city, but one which has been measured accurately. And you can see both the original clay tablet and the measurements drawn out, and the names of the temples and buildings there. Here's some other examples, just to give you an idea of the body of evidence here. There was a lot of a strong conception of the view from above and map making in ancient Mesopotamia. Here's another example of a clay tablet which shows the outline of a city. This is found in Babylon, in the 15th century before the Christian era. Here's a map of Nippur. So a very, very precocious example of mapping, again, from the Kassite period. And then another map, irrigation canals around Babylon. Finally, a landscape architect's plan. You see a bit of rectilinear work here in the 17th century before the Christian era. Much earlier, you have even earlier maps. So I'm going to run through quickly here and show just how early people were working on this form of geometry. What you see here are lines drawn in a strict or orthogonal fashion with measurements associated with them, and that's critical. To manage a city, you have to have a representation of it that is accurate in terms of its structure and its form, and also accurate in terms of its measurement. That's what we would now call data. And we use satellites and aerial photography and all kinds of surveys to create accurate data about cities. But this stuff was going on a lot earlier. And here we have a city property document, and it's pure data. Actually, there are measurements here in Shuruppak. Actually, it's a city in Mesopotamia during the Sumerian period, and this is just a set of measurements and a deed for property. You have house plans; these go back even earlier, and just to see how these measurements were done accurately. Well, the earliest description we have of how to divvy up a piece of land and get an accurate measurement of it is from Hero, a Greek mathematician, but much earlier the Mesopotamians were using the same method. So here you have the 3rd century, and then 21st century, they were doing this practice to allot property and manage property. So now I'll go into this, the ideological techniques here. And this is where the ideology merges with the technology. And in fact, this will tell us a lot about contemporary society. What we have in the movement between optics and geometry is the movement from the subjective to the objective. And that's critical to keep in mind. We've talked about subjectivity and the perspective, and we've seen photographs, we've seen paintings, and we've seen sculpture that show the difference between the subjective and the objective. The catalyst for forming techniques of subjectivity was probably the representation of the earth. People knew the earth was a globe thousands of years ago. How to represent that globe accurately for various reasons was problematic, and that resulted in the application of optics. Optics itself was a question that people wondered about and eventually solved by the 3rd century BC. But it all has to do with moving from that subjective view to what we may call the divine view, the view from above. And it's that geometric view that actually produces data. So there on the left, you have the subjective view, the world of illusion, the world of media, deep fakes now. For Plato, it was just fooling people into believing things that weren't true. Still happens. The objective view is critical for scientific truth, but also for ideological management. And let's look at why that is. Let's look at the evidence base for monumental architecture. And in the interest of time, I won't go too deeply into this, but what we have here are different texts from different periods in ancient Egypt where the king is actually getting involved in the first part of the survey. In the same way you have the mayor or even the president putting the foundation stone in. Instead of putting the foundation stone in, here he has the king and the chief ritual priest and the scribe of the sacred book stretched the cord, the stake in the earth. The king was crowned by the diadem at this time. Or the king himself performed with his 2 hands, stretching the cord and the extension of the line. In other words, creating truth on the ground. When we create monumental architecture or laid out a city, the king performs this. His Majesty commands to stretch the cord upon his temple. Monumental architecture being the ideological expression as well as practical expression of sovereignty and of rule. And it was important enough for the king to stretch the cord, to pull the line between not just your eye and the object, but between the objects, and to create a new objective reality. And what was that? Well, the representation of kingship. Ziggurat of Ur reconstructed, but this was 2,000 years ago. You have much earlier ones in Egypt, which I think everyone's familiar with all the kind of geometric tactics that had to be used to build the pyramids at Giza and many other pyramids. But what was this really about? It was about giving laws. So we have law codes, Hammurabi's being maybe the most famous, but Ur-Nammu, in Ur came out with one much earlier, but these were inscribed. And that kingship had to be validated. And part of the validation was through their capacity to create monumental architecture and to control the technologies, not only of perception, but of living. And here's Hammurabi getting the code of law from the god. We have Gudea, earlier than Hammurabi. He was the prince of Lagash, and Gudea, he's represented here with his head. Here's another representation of him. And what does he have in his lap? The plan for a temple. So these temples were the expression of political power. And here's a plan for a ziggurat, 20th century BC, pretty rare piece of cuneiform. Here's the evolution of temples. You can just see very quickly going up in Eridu, the earliest known city, from 50th century BC to the 30th century. They start out really small on the right and get very large and monumental. Same thing going on in Egypt. And you see the grid here being used to lay out a temple in the Thutmose dynasty. And but what this was really about was estate management. So Herodotus describes how Sesostris, the pharaoh, divided the soil of Egypt and did it in a grid. And, Egypt would flood, and periodically people had to be reassigned their property. Why did they have to be reassigned their property? They had to pay taxes. So the same thing was going on in Mesopotamia. You had accountants and scribes, and they were paying taxes too, or collecting taxes. So you had to know how many sheep were there, you had to know what the productivity of the land is, and this resulted in what? Accounting tablets. So a lot of this was just a database. And in fact, these cuneiform archives, not much papyrus has survived, but what we've found are large libraries of cuneiform, which we call archives, which essentially are databases. They reconstitute the data points of the culture, which, may be ducks and, sheep and things like that. But what were they really concerned with was food and grain. So what you had, a very important thing that they found a lot of are these beveled rim bowls for measuring grain, this is from the late Uruk period. But this was a measure of grain that was used not only as the basis of taxation, but also to determine the basic amount of surface area. The iku, the unit of surface area, was how much land you could sow with a bowl of grain. So this estate management was the thing that enabled kings to rule. You could call yourself king, and in fact, pre-urban civilization, cultures that didn't build cities and had geometry, for instance, and surveying, had kings, but those kings didn't have much power because they couldn't exercise it. So what we have with the archive and these drawings, but ultimately these databases, is a form of remote observation, which is still informed today. And in fact, the state wants to survey more and more. It accrues power through surveillance, through data points. Why are we so concerned about the gathering of data? Because it enables manipulation. It enables direct manipulation through saying, well, you earned this amount, you owe this much in taxes, this is how much you can spend. You can also use those same technologies to manipulate people's minds ideologically by using the projection of data to create illusions, whether it's bread and circuses that just distract people, or even fake forms of reality. And that temple and the ziggurats arguably are kind of they're fake mountains. They say this is the power of the king. The king raised this. The king is the blessed of God. The laws come from God. How does this happen? It happens through the knowledge of and the application of geometry. This ideology is an engineering project. It's techno-ideology. And it's impossible without it. I remember reading about a tribal king in a civilization or a culture that didn't have geometry, and the king they would basically manage their own land, and they would resolve disputes, and they had a title, but they didn't own things. In fact, we evolved to only own so much as we can perceive, which is about as much land as you can support a family with. Beyond that, civilization relies on technics. So here is the evidence now from sky gods. And the sky god is the primary ideological figure here. And even in atheistic societies, we have sky gods. So we're moving from this subjective view to the objective view, the orthogonal view, the geometric view being that of the sky god. Here's an aerial view of a city. This is the view of a sky god. Here's the aerial view of a city. This is the view of a sky god. There's a lot of evidence that people in ancient cultures knew what it was like, or could conceive what the view from above was like. You could argue that they said, well, how could they conceive that the sky god is looking down surveying us, the way a satellite would, the way an aerial camera would. Well, they describe it in the myth of Etana. An eagle takes a person upwards for a mile. They can look at the country. You can see all the affairs of the country buzzing like flies. And the sea is no wider than a sheepfold. You go up another mile, and the country is turned into a garden. They go up a third mile. This is 21st century, over 4,000 years ago. The Mesopotamians knew what it would like to be a god. They couldn't attain it. They couldn't send a rocket up or a plane. But using geometry and mathematics, they could create the same effect. And that was considered sacred to them. That was a sacred science. Scribes were priests. So they had this idea of the view from above, the divine view. And by the 6th century BC, they were trying it. Here's a Babylonian world map. Again, going back 30 centuries, the hymn to Enlil, one of the early sky gods, I'll just read a few lines. Whose lifted eye scans the land, whose lifted beam searches the heart of the land. The Lord great, the all-knowing, who understands judgment and whose pronouncement is unchangeable, who decrees destinies into the distant future. Here we have the use of technology being projected into political and social force through an ideology of objectivity and aerial perspective. Same thing with the hymn to Inanna. Inanna being Venus, another god, the Holy One stands alone in the clear sky. People look up in wonder. So now you have people being forced into a kind of, I'd say coerced into ideological conformity. Here's a god that's above you, sees everything, knows everything, controls everything. The representatives of that god lay out the land on the earth. They manage all the estates. Productivity depends on their worship. There's a lot of ideological effects woven into this, and we can see those in today's culture. I'll go quickly through some of the representations of this. You see up here in cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, different representations of gods in the sky as stars, as winged beings. Here's Shamash, represented as the sun, the god of the moon above Ur-Nammu, the king, the earliest known lawgiver, Ishtar, and Ninishkun, again, Venus, both as a person, but also represented as a kind of star, more gods. So finally, I'm going to wrap up here and get to the information age. And I will give you a quick reference, which I suggest you look up. Kent Flannery has written about how to have a complex civilization, you need to have different levels based on information sharing. At that top level, you have the king, and then you have information gatherers and a distribution through a social hierarchy. And I'll just make a reference to this because hierarchy and bureaucracy began in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. They have been repeated in other civilizations throughout the world. And just as a note, I have done some comparative work, and virtually every urban civilization has developed a kind of geometry, whether in Southeast Asia, say Harappa in India, or the Incas in Peru, although the pictorial representation aspect of it is one that has grown up in what we would roughly call Western culture or European culture around the Mediterranean. So let me just conclude with pictorial representation. You have what we call the Dürer grid, and I've mentioned the grid. The grid is that kind of geometric accuracy where you can make measurements, and with those measurements you can make drawings. Here's the view through Dürer's grid. You can see that the person's body is quite distorted, but you also know that what the geometry of the body is, the actual canon of proportion. Let's just remember how the grid can be used transformatively and rigorously to go from the objective to subjective perspective with scientific accuracy, staring into the grid, looking at the matrix. These are things that began quite early, and arguably we entered that kind of matrix, and it's ultimately about controlling the earth and looking at this sphere, which doesn't translate into our flat pictorial forms of representation quite so easily. But we can have local effects of it. Here's a map of Peoria, Indiana, which is actually quite gridded. So finally, I'll conclude. I talked about databases. Ultimately, this is not about pictorial representation. What a camera gathers is data. All these forms of data are combined into numbers, and those numbers can be projected with geometric accuracy onto a flat surface, but ultimately they consist of a set of measurements. And those measurements come in the form of ratios. So in the same way that your body has a standard ratio, this space that we see here, this is a ratio from here to here. These are all ratios. We know that this is actually just a flat grid, such as we see in the middle, but on the sides you have ratios, and those ratios can be used for all kinds of purposes. So let's just look and just reflect visually on some of these early cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal. We can look at this and, well, it's not a spreadsheet. It doesn't exactly have the same functions, but it sure looks an awful lot like one. And I think that's worth reflecting on. Why were they gathering these data? What were they using them for? And you see the cuneiform, those are letters and representations of, they could say land or ducks. The punched hole notches and the crescents are numbers. They were gathering numbers, and they were putting them into a form that was storable and manipulable and could be pulled out later and used to govern society. So we go back earlier and earlier and earlier, and we keep finding these data, and they're laid out in grids themselves. And in fact, the appearance of early data is much like the appearance of contemporary data. Finally, we can go back here and look, 5,000 years ago. These are field plans from Jemdet Nasser in Mesopotamia. This is a survey document, but it doesn't use optical representation. In fact, it took thousands of years for scribes, accountants, if you will, surveyors, to say, hey, it might be easier if we tag these data to an image. So some of those cadasters I showed earlier, where you have the inscriptions and the drawings with numbers beside them, are just ways of tagging data in a way that makes it easier for a human to absorb. In reality, they're pure numbers that can be manipulated in a space of pure numbers. And that space of pure numbers lies at the very origins of urban civilization, and it continues to govern us today. And to understand all the effects of telecommunications, virtual reality, lived reality, surveillance, and governance, as well as manipulation of governance, we need to understand the origins of these data and how they've been applied and developed through the ages, and how they're applying today, and how they echo their earliest use. Thank you very much.